Before this video ends, something you've been carrying for a long time is going to feel lighter. Not because life suddenly gets easier, but because the excuse that's been holding you back is about to lose its power. Right now, there's something you want to start. You already know what it is, and if you're being honest, the hardest part hasn't been the work. It's been the moment before the work. The hesitation, the overthinking, the fear that shows up the second you consider taking the first step. Stay with me, because this isn't another motivational talk that tells you to just believe. This is about understanding why fear feels so real, why waiting feels safe, and why starting feels impossible, and then breaking that pattern in a way that actually works. Every minute you watch this, you'll recognize yourself more clearly. You'll see why confidence never came first, why clarity never showed up, and why the people who move forward aren't braver. They're simply moving sooner. By the end of this, you won't just feel inspired. You'll feel exposed in the best way, because the fear you thought controlled you will finally make sense. And once fear makes sense, it loses its grip. So don't scroll. Don't skip ahead. Give me this time. And when it's over, starting won't feel heavy anymore. Fear doesn't disappear before action. It disappears because of action. And that truth alone explains why so many people stay stuck for years. Most people believe they must first feel ready, confident, or fearless before they begin. They wait for motivation to arrive like permission. But fear doesn't work that way. Fear is not a signal that you're unprepared. It's a signal that you're standing at the edge of growth. When you wait for fear to vanish, you're asking your brain to feel safe in an unfamiliar situation. And the brain's job is to do the opposite. It's designed to protect you, not to push you forward. So it creates stories, worst-case scenarios, and doubts to keep you exactly where you are. Action interrupts those stories. The moment you move, fear has to respond to reality instead of imagination. Before action, fear is abstract and exaggerated. It feels massive because it has no limits. But once you take even a small step, fear becomes specific, measurable, and manageable. You realize the email didn't destroy your reputation. The first video didn't end your career. The first attempt didn't expose you as incapable. What actually happens is almost always smaller than what you imagined. And that realization weakens fear instantly. Action also creates evidence. Fear thrives on assumptions, but confidence grows from proof. When you act, you collect data, you survive, you learned, you adjusted. That evidence rewires how you see yourself. Instead of I'm someone who's scared, your identity starts shifting to I'm someone who takes action even when scared. That identity change is powerful because fear loses its authority over someone who has proven they can move anyway. This is why planning forever feels productive but changes nothing. Planning keeps fear alive because nothing challenges it. Action, even imperfect action, forces fear into the background. The body follows behavior, not the other way around. You don't act because you feel brave. You feel brave because you acted. Each small step reduces fear's size, not because the risk disappears, but because your tolerance for discomfort increases and the unknown starts to look familiar instead of threatening. And once fear becomes familiar, it no longer controls your decisions. Waiting for confidence is the fastest way to stay stuck because confidence is not a prerequisite for action. It is a byproduct of it. Most people reverse the order. They believe one day they'll wake up feeling ready, certain, and sure of themselves, and then they'll finally begin. But that day never comes because confidence doesn't show up in advance. It shows up after repetition, after exposure, after doing the thing you were unsure you could do. When you wait for confidence, you are waiting for proof without ever running the experiment. Confidence is built through evidence, and evidence only comes from action. Every time you delay, you reinforce the identity of someone who hesitates. The brain is always taking notes, and when it sees you back away again and again, it learns that avoidance is the safer option. That's how waiting quietly trains fear to stay in charge. You don't lose confidence because you failed, you lose confidence because you never gave yourself a chance to succeed or even to learn. The truth is, confident people are not more certain than you. They are simply more familiar with discomfort. They've done the thing enough times that the fear feels smaller, not because the risk vanished, but because their nervous system adapted. When you wait for confidence, you deny yourself that adaptation. You stay in theory instead of reality. And theory always feels heavier than execution. Starting without confidence feels uncomfortable, awkward, and exposed, but that discomfort is temporary. Staying stuck feels safer in the moment, but it creates long-term frustration, regret, and self-doubt. The irony is that waiting for confidence creates the very insecurity you're trying to avoid. Every delay becomes silent proof in your mind that maybe you're not capable, not ready, not meant for this, even though none of that has been tested. Action breaks that loop. The first step doesn't require confidence, it creates it. Even a small move sends a signal to your brain that you are someone who acts. That signal compounds. One action leads to another. Clarity increases, fear loses its grip, and confidence starts to form naturally, not as a feeling, but as trust in yourself. And once you trust yourself to move even when unsure, you stop waiting and start becoming the person you thought you needed confidence to be. Starting small beats planning perfectly, because progress is created by movement, not by perfection. Perfect plans feel productive, but most of the time they are just sophisticated delays. People convince themselves they're being responsible by thinking everything through, mapping every step, and waiting until conditions are ideal. What's really happening is fear is hiding behind preparation. Planning gives the illusion of control, while starting small exposes you to uncertainty. And the human mind naturally avoids uncertainty even when growth depends on it. Small starts lower the emotional cost of action. When a task feels massive, the brain treats it like a threat, triggering resistance, procrastination, and overthinking. But when you shrink the starting point, the brain relaxes. Sending one message, recording one rough clip, writing one messy page, or taking one simple step feels manageable. That's why small actions are powerful. They bypass the fear response and get you moving. And once you're moving, momentum does the heavy lifting. Perfect planning assumes you can predict reality before you enter it, which is almost never true. You don't actually know what works until you interact with the real world. Starting small gives you feedback early, and feedback is more valuable than flawless plans. It shows you what matters, what doesn't, and where to adjust. People who plan perfectly but never start stay stuck in assumptions, while people who start small learn faster and improve in real time. There is also a psychological shift that happens when you take a small step. You stop identifying as someone who is about to start and become someone who has already begun. That identity change is subtle but powerful. It reduces internal resistance because your mind no longer debates whether you should start. It focuses on what to do next. Each small win builds credibility with yourself, and that self-trust compounds. Perfectionism often disguises itself as high standards, but in reality, it creates paralysis. Small starts cut through. That by proving that imperfect action still produces results. You don't need the full map to begin, you just need enough direction to take the next step. Once that step is taken, clarity increases, fear decreases, and progress becomes inevitable, not because everything was planned perfectly, but because you chose motion over hesitation. Most fear is imagined pain, not real consequences. And that distinction explains why fear feels so intense before action and so manageable after it. The mind is incredibly skilled at projecting worst-case scenarios. It takes uncertainty and fills in the gaps with exaggerated outcomes: embarrassment, rejection, failure, loss of respect, or permanent damage. These outcomes feel real because the brain reacts to imagined threats the same way it reacts to real ones. Your body responds with tension, avoidance, and anxiety, even though nothing has actually happened yet. Before you act, fear has unlimited space to grow because it is not constrained by facts. It feeds on questions with no answers and scenarios with no evidence. What if I fail? What if people judge me? What if I waste time? These questions loop endlessly, creating emotional pain in advance. That pain feels protective, but it's actually draining. You end up suffering twice, once in imagination and again through regret for not moving. Real consequences, when they exist, are usually smaller and more temporary than imagined ones. A rejection might sting, but it fades. A mistake might slow you down, but it teaches you. An awkward moment might feel uncomfortable, but it rarely matters long term. When you finally act, fear is forced to confront reality, and reality has limits. There are rules, timelines, and recovery paths. Imagined fear has none of that. It is infinite, vague, and overwhelming. Action exposes this gap between imagination and reality. The moment you take a step, you realize that most outcomes are neutral, some are helpful, and very few are truly damaging. Even when something goes wrong, you gain clarity instead of confusion. You learn what to fix, what to avoid, and what actually matters. That learning reduces fear far more effectively than reassurance or positive thinking ever could. The real danger is not the imagined pain itself, but how long it controls your decisions. When fear is imagined, it keeps you frozen without costing you anything immediately, but over time, it steals opportunities, growth, and self-respect. Real consequences are finite. Imagined fear is endless. Once you understand that most of what you're afraid of lives only in your head, fear loses its power because you stop treating thoughts as facts and start measuring risk based on reality instead of assumption. Momentum is built in seconds, not years, because change doesn't begin with massive effort. It begins with a decision followed by immediate movement. People often believe progress requires long stretches of time, perfect conditions, or sustained motivation, but momentum actually starts the instant you take the first action. That first move, no matter how small, shifts you from thinking to doing, and that shift happens in seconds. Once you move, your mind reorients around action instead of hesitation. The hardest part of any task is not the work itself, it's the transition from stillness to motion. When you're idle, everything feels heavier because there is no evidence that progress is possible. The moment you act, resistance drops. Your brain stops debating and starts engaging. That engagement creates energy. You feel more capable not because the task changed, but because you are now participating in it. Momentum is less about speed and more about direction. Seconds matter because they break inertia. Opening the document, sending the message, standing up, or making the first call takes very little time, but it changes everything. Those small actions signal to your nervous system that you are safe to proceed. Each action reduces uncertainty, and reduced uncertainty makes the next action easier. That chain reaction is what people experience as momentum, and it often starts faster than they expect. Waiting for large blocks of time delays momentum indefinitely. When you tell yourself you'll start, when you have more time, more clarity, or more energy, you stay stationary. But when you start in seconds, you bypass those conditions entirely. You don't need to finish, you only need to begin. Once you begin, the likelihood of continuing increases dramatically because your brain prefers completion over interruption. Momentum also builds belief. Each quick action becomes proof that you can move forward despite resistance. That proof compounds, turning hesitation into confidence and fear into focus. Over time, those seconds add up to real progress, but it's important to understand that the breakthrough never happens in the years you imagined it would take. It happens in the moment you decide to act and follow that decision immediately, because momentum is not something you wait for. It is something you create the instant you move. Why? Don't need clarity to start. You get clarity after you start because clarity is not a starting condition. It is a result of engagement. Most people believe they must fully understand the path before taking the first step. They want guarantees, certainty, and a complete map. But clarity doesn't exist in isolation. It only forms when you interact with reality. Without action, you are guessing. With action, you are learning. Before you begin, everything feels foggy because your mind is working with assumptions instead of feedback. You imagine multiple outcomes, possibilities, and risks, and that mental noise creates confusion. Waiting for clarity keeps you trapped in that noise. Action cuts through it. The moment you start, even in a small way, information becomes available. You see what works, what doesn't, and what actually matters. That information is clarity. Starting without clarity feels uncomfortable because it forces you to move without certainty, but that discomfort is the price of insight. Every meaningful direction in life becomes clear only after movement. You don't discover the right strategy by thinking harder. You discover it by testing, adjusting, and responding. Each step reveals the next one, not because the path was always clear, but because action creates visibility. Clarity also depends on experience, and experience cannot be simulated in your head. You can plan endlessly and still be wrong. You can think you know what you want and discover something better once you begin. Many people delay starting because they fear choosing the wrong path, but staying still guarantees no path at all. Movement allows correction. Stillness allows only speculation. Action shifts your identity from someone searching for answers to someone gathering evidence. That shift changes how you think. Instead of asking, "What should I do?" you start asking, "What did I learn?" That mindset naturally produces clarity over time. You stop needing everything to make sense up front because you trust the process of learning through action. Clarity gained through action is stronger than clarity imagined beforehand. It is grounded in reality, shaped by results, and refined through repetition. Once you understand that clarity follows movement, not the other way around, you stop waiting for certainty and start building it step by step, because the path becomes clear only to those who are already walking it. Regret lasts longer than failure ever will, because failure is an event, while regret becomes a story you live with. Failure happens in a moment. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. It might hurt, embarrass, or disappoint you, but over time it fades, especially when you learn from it. Regret, on the other hand, grows quietly. It stays unresolved because nothing ever happened to give it closure. It turns into questions that never stop asking themselves what might have been. Failure teaches you something concrete. It gives you feedback, direction, and often resilience. Even painful failures usually come with lessons that strengthen you. Regret offers none of that. It doesn't sharpen your skills or expand your understanding. It simply reminds you that you didn't try. That reminder can resurface years later, triggered by a conversation, an opportunity you see someone else take, or a quiet moment when distractions fade. Failure fades with time. ET resurfaces with time. The fear of failure often feels more intense than the reality of failing. When you imagine failing, you picture long-term damage to your identity or future, but most failures don't have lasting consequences. People move on, circumstances change, and you recover faster than expected. Regret is different because it is self-inflicted. You can't blame timing, resources, or external factors. You know the opportunity existed, and you chose not to act, and that awareness lingers. Failure also preserves your sense of agency. When you try and fail, you still know you showed up. You did what you could with what you knew at the time. That knowledge brings peace. Even if the outcome wasn't what you wanted, regret steals that peace. It replaces it with self-doubt and second-guessing. Over time, regret shapes identity in a negative way, turning I tried into I should have. As life moves forward, the window for certain opportunities closes. You age, circumstances change, and paths narrow. At that point, failure would have been temporary pain, but regret becomes permanent weight. The people who grow the most are not those who avoided failure, but those who refuse to let regret decide their future, because taking the risk and failing still leaves you free, while never starting leaves you trapped in the echo of what could have been. If there's one truth to take with you from this entire message, it's this: fear was never the enemy, waiting was. Fear only feels powerful when you stand still. The moment you move even slightly, it begins to shrink. You don't need confidence first. You don't need perfect plans, and you don't need total clarity. What you need is the courage to act before you feel ready, because readiness is created through action, not before it. Everything you want on the other side of fear is built step by step, moment by moment. Starting small, moving quickly, learning in real time, and choosing action over imagination changes how you see yourself. Failure becomes feedback. Momentum becomes natural. Clarity becomes earned, and regret, the heaviest weight of all, never gets the chance to grow. You are not behind. You are not broken. You are not lacking something others have. You are simply one decision away from motion, and motion changes everything. When you choose to start, fear stops being a wall and becomes a signal that you exactly where growth begins. Good luck on the path you're about to take. Whatever you're starting, start it honestly, start it imperfectly, and start it now. Thank you for giving your time, your attention, and your trust to this message. If this helped you even a little, take the next step and put it into action, because the real transformation begins the moment you do.